United Kingdom's a funny old thing. An alliance of foreign nations in a single country out of convenience more than anything else. Scotland is an even foreigner country to England than Wales is. In fact, it almost voted to become literally a foreign country just a few months back. Well, almost in the sense that it was an option on the ballot. They were never in much danger of actually doing it, but que sera, sera. But the point is, Scotland, different country. Which is why it's fitting that Scotland, like Ulster, and unlike the rest of the country, has a truly independent television service to call its own. Well, I suppose Wales has S4C, but let's not spoil the metaphor. But of course that doesn't mean proud Alba has been spared the Broadcasting Act takeover routine. There used to be 3 ITV regions in Scotland. One, Border, has already been covered. The main region, run by the efficiently named Scottish Television, began in 1957 and grew into something of a media giant in its own right. Its Highland cousin Grampian, by comparison, was a wee sleekit timorous beastie, which only started in 1961, only survived the Broadcasting Act by default, and eventually surrendered its independence and identity to its massive lowland neighbours. These are their stories. So what with Scotland being this impressively big and proud country in its own right, it was obviously a fairly high priority for an ITV region after the initial 3 large chunks of England had been assigned. And indeed the very first new franchise to be awarded was in Scotland, specifically Central Scotland. There wasn't yet a transmitter powerful enough to cover the whole thing, and building a new one was a project in itself. And so it was that on the 31st of August 1957, the residents of the sort of lower left chunk of Scotland were greeted with this thing on their Channel 10 screens.
This is Scotland.
Out of a bunch of potential Scottish motifs they could have used, and they did end up using most of them, the first one they picked was the Lion Rampant, from the royal standard of the King of Scots, initially in a properly heraldic and tastefully modernist quartered form alongside the main letters. Later it was set spinning in genuinely dizzying fashion comme ceci. This may have caused widespread bouts of spontaneous travel sickness throughout central Scotland, because it was soon replaced with this somewhat less frivolous format.
This is Scotland.
It certainly is, Keith, or 1/3 of it at least. The rest of Alba got their ITV coverage over the course of a single month in 1961. Border was launched on the 1st of September to serve Dumfries and Galloway and that sort of thing, along with the nosebleed north of England. And then at the other end of the month, the frozen north and northeast, Perth and Dundee and Aberdeen, the mountains and the lochs and the islands, were presented with Grampian television. Grampian was yet another shotgun marriage, originally formed out of a partial merger between the franchise winners, North of Scotland Television, and the similarly excitingly named runners-up, Caledonia Television and North Caledonia Television. Given the partial merger and the fact that North of Scotland TV was far too boring a name for the new channel, the service was renamed. An apocryphal story claims that they first considered Scottish Highlands and Islands Television, until they looked at it written down for the first time. This is unlikely, but we can always hope. Instead, they named themselves after the big old mountain range in the Highlands that includes Ben Nevis. This was Mountain People's Television, or at least that's how the name always made it seem, and the initial ident reinforced that impression. You snooze, you lose. Scottish picked the Lion Rampant for their emblem, which left Grampian free to claim the Saltire as their own, and they did. It was their logo until the day they died as an independent company. The theme tune, a jolly little adaptation of Scotland the Brave, would prove to be almost as sturdy. As is usually the case, these idents poodled along for a decade until colour came along. Scottish first got colour in 1969, and they responded with a new ident, a new logo, and a new name. Welcome to STV. If the abbreviation is a bit vague for you, well, don't worry. Just in case any of us Susnecks might have forgotten what the S stood for, the production captions at the time made it abundantly clear. Grampian's first colour ident came a little later, and arguably made better use of the new technology, coming across as a sort of cheaper Scottish equivalent of ITV's Zoom 2. I do have to wonder what's going on with the music. An ethereal Glinda of Oz harp, followed by the Scotland the Brave theme on vibraphone, and then a bit more harp to play us out. I'm not saying it's unpleasant, because it isn't, it's just not particularly authoritative. Later on in the 70s, STV bowed to the inevitable and incorporated tartan into the ident. That in turn led to this unanimated variation, which to me looks a bit like a stained glass window. Maybe it's a tribute to Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Or maybe not. Eventually they settled on this extremely plain and motionless slide, ticking off yet another dated cliché about the Scots, that they're cheap. My family has no Scots blood whatsoever, and yet the opening of their wallets and or purses will require the deployment of at least 3 of the 6 simple machines, usually the wheel and pulley system. And so it went until the mid-80s. Here come the computer graphics, and for Scottish, who retook their full name in the process, a chance to swap their long-standing but visually uninspiring logo for a visual mascot that would hold them in good stead until they became the kind of media juggernaut that doesn't really have to worry about such things as logos anymore. I never had any idea what that was supposed to be. But it said Scottish television underneath it. It meant Scotland, and I accepted that. Of course, to those of us who aren't 5 years old, it's obvious what it's meant to be. It's a thistle. A sort of ASCII thistle rendered in geometric shapes with a flat top, but a thistle nonetheless. This was by far the most successful of the traditional, or you might say cliched, Scottish images that they used. The lion rampant sold hat, tartan didn't work, let's try the thistle. Forming up, you'll have noticed from the obligatory shiny clear surface suspended in a void, from which most of the baffling computer-generated logos sprang back in those days. The obvious exception being the progenitor of the form, Channel 4. They obviously didn't think the viewers would be particularly worried where the blocks came from. And frankly, we weren't, but only Channel 4 seemed to realise that. Grampian went all pixely around about the same time, except they went in a completely different direction. Where Scottish were trying to be all authoritative and iconic, Grampian just decided to have fun with their new toy. And they came up with this. A colourful, kinetic, slightly psychedelic piece that looked somewhat akin to what you might imagine a Glaswegian would see towards the end of a particularly successful Burns night. The icing on the acid-laced cake is the way Scotland the Brave just sort of marches in towards the end of the jingle, in quite ridiculously jolly and totally unself-conscious fashion. Grampian stuck with this for practically the rest of the decade. Scottish, however, were restless. They created an iconic symbol, almost a mascot, for the station, and they couldn't help but fiddle around with it. The first variation was fairly standard, repurposing the ident by placing it in front of the graph paper it seemed to have been designed on, to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the channel. The Thistle was distinctive enough that it didn't take long for it to achieve the Identites/HTV trick of coming to represent the station purely iconographically, without needing any lettering at all. Before long, the Thistle, central cake-like, was cropping up in various interesting poses and locales. In the midst of all this, of course, was the usual in-vision continuity, although there was a sharp difference between the two companies' approaches. In Scottish's case, while as STV they'd been happy enough, not to mention rich enough, to afford to build their own flats with the logo on, instead of just using a curtain like some of the smaller companies, after the Thistle made its debut, IVC slowly started to die out in central Scotland. It was finally phased out altogether in 1991, although by then it had only been seen at night for the previous 2 years. A shame, because their vision had been excellent, led by the unflappable, square-jawed international man of mystery, Tony Currie.
And if it's late night viewing you're after tomorrow night on Scottish television, please don't miss Bette Midler with No Frills at 11:55 on Sunday night. You'll enjoy it, I promise you. Well, I'll say good night.
However, Grampian didn't scrap it at all, until their inevitable takeover in 1998, when their own continuity studios were closed down. And that was despite the fact that sometimes they did need to use curtains instead of backdrops. Of course, the two companies sometimes shared announcers, most notably Colin Lamont, played here by Patrick Marber. The Thistle's ascendancy was briefly interrupted in 1989, when ITV introduced their generic look, which Scottish grudgingly adopted for about 11 minutes.
You're watching Scottish television on the ITV network.
And yet again, you have to wonder if they're even trying to represent the local station in that little triangle. Scottish certainly weren't impressed, and dropped it after only intermittently using it for a couple of months in favour of a revamped Thistle, which we'll see in a moment. Grampian, on the other hand...
A Friday night film in half an hour is Future World, that follows the news from ITN.
In a way, Grampian were lucky in that their logo, the Saltire, was actually quite well suited to this kind of triangular adaptation, unlike almost everybody else's. Although having said that, they still managed to do something weird to it. So taken were they, in fact, with the generic ident that they held on to it for longer than anyone else in the country or countries. Practically the entire 90s. Long after the Get Ready campaign was dead and forgotten, Grampian was still using David Dundas's saxophone. It took ITV dropping this logo altogether to get Grampian to move on. Of course, they might have had other reasons for sticking with it. A lack of money, perhaps? A certain broadcasting act may not have helped? Although all three Scottish franchisees survived the 1991 round, it can still be reasonably said to have brought the country mixed fortunes. Border and Scottish were ultimately unopposed, and in fact the latter were among the jammiest, having, like Central, bid a measly £2,000. They even managed to capitalise on another company's downfall by taking responsibility for some of the outgoing TVS kid shows like Art Attack and How To, thanks largely to the fact that the man who commissioned them in the first place for TVS jumped ship to Scottish after they lost the franchise. Grampian weren't so lucky. Their region was big, but not very populous. Consequently, the franchise was always much smaller and more humble than it looked. They survived the previous franchise rounds, of course, under the rules of a simple review process. But in the post-Broadcasting Act age, previous form was no longer important, except potentially in the event of a tiebreaker situation. Grampian underbid horrifically at a mere £720,000 a year, and came third, behind a consortium ironically called North of Scotland Television, and one called Channel 3 Caledonia. But at the last minute it was decided that neither of their competitors could make it over that nebulous quality threshold. Grampian held on to their franchise, but a strata cornea on the skin of their teeth, now paying $720,000 for the privilege. So ultimately it had turned out just like one of the old-fashioned franchise rounds, only far more stressful and expensive. So perhaps it's unsurprising that their presentation throughout the 90s was based around a cheap old ident that they didn't even make. But of course their more urban compatriots didn't have that problem. After they dropped the generic look like a hot potato, the Thistle returned, now slightly fatter and more laid back, to serve in various iterations throughout the 90s, starting with this oddity. For some mad reason, this ident reminds me of Eastern European animation, only slicker. Of course, by 1990, the whole computer-generated objects trundling around in 3 dimensions aesthetic was starting to date. And then were just about to start a completely new graphical renaissance via BBC Two. But the Thistle was flexible enough to survive, whether being intercut with Scottish scenery, viewed through a misty gauze, or whatever was going on with those tiddlywinks. In 1993, the stern, moody navy blue was traded for this impressionistic thing in which the Thistle is barely discernible. That's the second least authoritative ident I've ever seen. Eventually they settled on a nice traditional ident with a form-up that wasn't trying quite as hard to be clever as the discs, and a wavy purple backdrop as was the style at the time. This was seen interchangeably with and without the station's name at the bottom. While all that was happening on screen, big things were afoot behind the scenes, as Scottish, like Carlton and Granada before them, began to look into expansion. Styling themselves the Scottish Media Group, or SMG, they started with Glaswegian newspapers, which have since sold off incidentally, and moved on to acquiring the likes of Pearl and Dean and Virgin Radio. Most importantly though, and again just like Granada and Carlton, they bought another ITV franchise. Guess which one? The tottering form of Grampian Television, a small company and a network that no longer had any room for anyone that wasn't going to be a super heavyweight, finally fell into the arms of SMG in 1997. In all likelihood, Grampian could never have survived the 90s as an independent broadcaster because the world no longer worked in their favour. The mere existence of someone like Grampian or, say, West Country or Border runs contrary to the free market realpolitik philosophy of targeting as many people and gaining as many customers as possible by any means necessary and at any cost. And you can't do that when you're explicitly aiming for a regional audience. But Grampian didn't die, at least not at first, although there were massive layoffs, and most importantly and horrifyingly to the residents of Grampian's catchment area, the transfer of Grampian's presentation and continuity from Aberdeen, that venerable Highland city, well, Highland adjacent, which is close enough for ITV's purposes, to Scottish's headquarters in Glasgow, spelling the end for Grampian's in-vision continuity, and leaving Ulster as the last bastion of the practice. Even the ITC got involved at one point, rapping SMG on the knuckles for not doing enough regional programming in their Grampian area. This brave new world was heralded in 1998 with Grampian's first new set of idents since 1989. Finally, after a near decade with the increasingly outdated 1989 generic ident, their hand forced by ITV's decision to drop the logo, the Highland Scots got this on their screens instead. Basically using the Saltire in the same way that Scottish had been using the Thistle for the past decade. It's actually pretty good, certainly authoritative. Shame about the music, but it's entirely possible they didn't bother composing a new jingle because they knew this look wasn't going to last very long. SMG were here to stay, and they had plans. By now the Scottish idents have become shinier and less purple, but were still pretty much the same thing, although the new orchestral tune was, to my ears, a marked improvement. But no amount of brasso and pledge could hide the fact that that teletext-looking blocky logo was seeming increasingly dated as the 20th century drew to a close. So at the dawn of the new millennium, everything changed. Thistle faded away from Scottish screens forever on the 20th of February 2000. It was the dawn of a whole new identity for Scottish television. And I don't just mean the station of that name. Welcome to the future. Scottish television, or Scottish TV as the style guide insisted everybody refer to it from now on, was scrubbed up from top to toe with a theme that could be charitably described as ambient, or uncharitably as bland. The now familiar live-action tableau of visibly staged ordinariness would be the order of the day, accompanied by some tasteful London chill-out room electronica and a logo that consisted solely of a blue square. Sure, there's some lighting effects in the idents themselves, but you can't really replicate that for such as a letterhead or even a production caption. It's a blue square. There's nothing wrong with these idents in a technical sense. They're well shot and everything, but one keeps returning to that word bland. The key word is coolness, not in the sense of being trendy, although they certainly were at the time, but in the sense of being cold. Icy trip-hop music, muted colour palette, and a logo that barely qualifies as a logo in the first place. Even the text is in evenly spaced thin sans serif. Anything that could stimulate the viewer's imagination has been carefully set aside, in case it inspires them to move or to change the channel. It is definitely Scottish though. These idents truly pioneered the customised picture postcard format of showing pretty people in pretty places up and down the country, a template that ITV in particular still follow to this day. Even Channel 4 is still working from the same basic biscuit cutter, just with their own original icing on top. It used to be fairly obvious whether you were watching an advert, a trailer, an ident, or the programme itself. Now you never know where you are. Scottish didn't invent that, but it did help popularise it. And what of Grampian? Welp. There is no Grampian. The name lived on as a sort of vestigial tale, and they had a few picture postcard idents of their own, but with the same identity and mostly the same regional programming as Scottish, for all intents and purposes it was the same thing. Not that SMG cared. At the start of the 21st century they were fast becoming a major player in the UK media scene. And to be fair to them, while they may not have cared about any possible difference between the rural north and the urban centre and south, they did care about Scotland in general. And the Scottish identity was behind most of their attempts at expansion. The first had been back in 1996, shortly after the launch of the G-Sky B channels. Naturally, Scottish wanted some of that action, and so was born Sky Scottish.
This is Sky Scottish.
Apparently aimed at lonely expatriates who missed the likes of Take the High Road. Scottish entered into a 7-year contract with that man Murdoch, himself of Scots blood or possibly acid, to launch this channel. This seemed insanely optimistic at the time, and was, because Sky Scottish failed to attract more than 10 million viewers at any one time, unless Rangers or Celtic were on, and closed after just 18 months in May 1998. Less than a year later, Scottish tried again with S2, their answer to ITV2. Why they press-ganged the rediffusion ad Astral into service, I don't know. But it didn't really matter ultimately, as S2 swiftly went the same way as Sky Scottish. By mid-2001 it was basically simulcasting ITV2 with their own logo crudely glued into the corner of the screen, much to ITV's irritation. This was fooling precisely no one, and by July they basically just gave up and went home. SMG was smart enough not to try it a third time, and instead decided to focus on actually running what it did have. In 2003, ITV imposed the celebrity-faced idents on them whether they liked it or not, but just like UTV and Channel, SMG barely used them in either region, if they could help it, and that only for about 4 months at the most. By 2006, both UTV and ITV were regularly showing up to sound out the possibility of a merger and or takeover, but SMG doggedly priced themselves out of the market. However, there was no getting away from the fact that by now they barely made any programming intended for Scottish exclusive consumption at all anymore, and what's more, the consumers were starting to notice it. Restructuring was in order, and that had to start on screen. After 6 years of ambient stupid, 6 years being more or less the average lifespan of an ident package, they announced another major change. To no one's great surprise, Grampian were officially dead. They already had been, in all but name, since 2000, but now it was official. More shocking was the news that the name Scottish TV was also being dropped. Long live STV.
Good morning, this is STV.
All pretense of separate franchises were gone. Scotland was now a unified whole, apart from the bits in the south which were still served by an increasingly bewildered border, who by now were being picked on as nonsensical by everyone, including the chairman of ITV itself. And an old name had returned to life. The new idents were superficially similar, but to my mind much superior. The music is less aggravating, the lighting is warmer, and most importantly, it's more than just a set of shots of Scottish people blandly smiling into the camera as a blue square fades into view. This time the people are actually taking part in the ident, with a solid, recognisable and memorable central symbol, with which the various cast members actually interact. There was some small outcry in the Grampian region about the loss of their name, but the writing had been on the wall in 500-foot Helvetica for quite some time on that subject. In the end, the outcry amounted to more of a weary sigh about the inevitable. STV rebranded again in 2009, introducing the triangular motif, which has stayed with them ever since. Their last refresh was last year, effectively an adaptation.
Joseph is leaving her Essex birds for the time being and joining the loose women for a good old chinwag now. Great.
They're still as stubbornly foreign as ever, refusing to stop making Tavet until ITV smacked them on the head and ordered them to knock it off. Alex Salmond may have failed to sell the country on full sovereign independence, but that doesn't mean they're happy to be equated with them Sassenachs, let alone run by them. This is Scotland, and it always will be.
subtitled, You Don't Have to Use Words. That's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? I mean, you don't have to use... How can I close down without using words? The only thing I can think of to do is